August 10th, 1940, Hall, 50 miles north of Berlin. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring stood before an enormous map of southern England, a riding crop tapping impatiently against his thigh. The portly commander of the Luftwaffe, dressed in a powder blue uniform dripping with medals, turned to face his assembled squadron commanders with absolute confidence, radiating from every gesture. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming across the oak-paneled hall, "I give you 3 days. 3 days to destroy the Royal Air Force. 3 days to sweep their pathetic remnants from the sky." The room erupted in cheers. These were the men who had crushed Poland in weeks, demolished France in days, scattered the British at Dunkirk like leaves before a storm. They had every reason to believe their commander. The Luftwaffe was the most powerful air force the world had ever seen. 2,000 bombers, 900 fighters, veterans hardened by 2 years of continuous victory. Across the English Channel, Fighter Command counted barely 600 serviceable aircraft. The British had lost 300 fighters in France. Their pilots were exhausted. Their airfields were within easy reach of German bases. The mathematics of destruction seemed simple and inevitable. What Göring didn't know, what none of his confidently smiling commanders could have imagined, was that they were about to collide with something that couldn't be measured by counting aircraft or calculating bomb loads. They were about to discover that some nations, when pushed to the absolute edge of extinction, don't break. They harden like steel in a forge. The promise made that summer morning in Hall would haunt Göring for the rest of his life. The 3 days would stretch into 3 months of carnage. And when the smoke finally cleared, the Luftwaffe would be broken beyond repair, its invincibility shattered forever over the green fields and gray skies of southern England. This is the story of how Britain made Hermann Göring regret every word. The German plan, codenamed Adlerangriff or Eagle Attack, was built on what appeared to be unassailable logic. Oberst Paul Deissmann, Chief of Staff for Luftflotte II, had prepared the operational assessment that landed on Göring's desk in early August. The numbers were intoxicating. The Luftwaffe possessed 1,480 bombers spread across bases in France, Belgium, Holland, and Norway. Heinkel 111s that could carry 4,000 pounds of explosives. Dornier 17s known as flying pencils for their sleek profiles. Junkers 88s that had terrorized Spain during the Civil War. Each type had proven deadly effective. Each had demonstrated the ability to strike with devastating precision. Supporting them were 900 single-engine fighters. The Messerschmitt 109 had dominated every sky it entered. In Spain, it had massacred Republican aircraft. Over Poland, it had wiped out the Polish Air Force in days. In France, it had sent the Royal Air Force reeling back across the Channel. The 109 was fast, heavily armed, and flown by pilots who had never known defeat. Against this armada, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding commanded Fighter Command with just over 600 operational aircraft, mainly Hawker Hurricanes, solid workhorses that were slightly slower than the German fighters, and around 300 Supermarine Spitfires, beautiful machines that could match the 109 in speed, but were desperately scarce. The German intelligence summary compiled by Major Joseph Schmid of the 5th Section painted an even bleaker picture for the British. According to Schmid's assessment, Fighter Command had approximately 350 serviceable fighters remaining. British pilot training couldn't possibly replace losses. British industrial production was inadequate to sustain prolonged combat. British morale was shattered after Dunkirk. Every assumption was catastrophically wrong. But on August 13th, 1940, as the first waves of German bombers assembled over France for Eagle Day, these mistakes hadn't yet revealed themselves. Hauptmann Horst Tietzen, a veteran bomber pilot with Kampfgeschwader II, recorded his thoughts as his Dornier 17 climbed toward the Channel. "We fly to finish what we started at Dunkirk," he wrote in his diary that evening. "The English have nothing left. Our intelligence says they can muster perhaps 100 fighters at most. We have the entire might of the Reich behind us. This will be over in days. Perhaps the Reichsmarschall was being pessimistic. We may not need 3 days." At RAF Biggin Hill, Squadron Leader Sailor Milan of 74 Squadron was watching the operations board light up with raid warnings. A South African who had joined the RAF before the war, Milan had already claimed 16 German aircraft. He turned to his flight, a mix of veteran pilots and teenagers who had finished training just weeks ago. "The bastards think they'll walk through us," he said quietly, his accent still carrying traces of Cape Town. "They think we're beaten. They're about to learn different." The German formations crossed the coast at midday. 100 bombers escorted by 60 fighters heading for the airfields at Detling and Eastchurch. Another 70 bombers targeting Middle Wallop. A third formation of 50 heading toward Southampton. What happened next shocked the German air crews to their core. The sky erupted with British fighters. Not a handful of desperate defenders, but squadron after squadron diving from the sun, tearing into the bomber formations with a fury that bordered on madness. The Germans had expected scattered resistance. They got coordinated fury. Flight Lieutenant James Nicholson of 249 Squadron was leading a section of 3 Hurricanes when they encountered a formation of Junkers 88s near Southampton. His combat report filed later that day captured the intensity. "We came down in line astern. I gave the leader a 3-second burst from 200 yards. He started burning immediately and fell away. As I pulled up, and 109 got me from behind. My aircraft caught fire. My left foot was hit. I could feel the heat through my boots as the fire spread into the cockpit. Any sane man would have bailed out." Nicholson was on fire in a burning aircraft at 15,000 feet. Instead, he spotted a Messerschmitt 110 twin-engine fighter positioning to attack the bombers from below. "I couldn't let him have a free shot at our bombers," Nicholson continued. "I stayed in the cockpit and lined him up, gave him a 4-second burst. He went down smoking. Then I bailed out. My hands were burned, my face was burned, but I got the bastard." James Nicholson would receive the only Victoria Cross awarded to Fighter Command during the entire war. But his action on Eagle Day exemplified something the Germans hadn't counted on. British pilots weren't fighting to win. They were fighting because surrender meant extinction. By nightfall on August 13th, the Luftwaffe had lost 47 aircraft. Fighter Command had lost 13. Göring's 3-day promise was already looking optimistic. What the Luftwaffe pilots didn't know, what German intelligence had completely failed to detect, was that they weren't fighting just the Royal Air Force. They were fighting a system, an integrated air defense network unlike anything that existed anywhere in the world. The foundation was Chain Home, a ring of radar stations stretching along the British coast. These ungainly steel towers, some 350 feet tall, could detect aircraft up to 100 miles away. They couldn't tell you much, just bearing, range, and rough altitude. But that was enough. The information flowed to Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory, where Air Chief Marshal Dowding had created something revolutionary. A filter room where Women's Auxiliary Air Force plotters moved markers across a giant map table, tracking every raid in real time. Group controllers watched from a gallery above, coordinating the squadrons. From Bentley Priory, information cascaded down to group headquarters, then to sector stations, then to the individual squadrons. From the moment German aircraft took off from French airfields to the moment British fighters engaged them, the entire dance was choreographed by operators speaking calmly into telephones. Oberst Theo Osterkamp, commander of Jagdfliegerführer II, the fighter unit supporting Luftflotte II, began noticing something disturbing after the first week of operations. The British were always there, not stumbling into combat by accident, not responding sluggishly after being surprised. They were waiting at altitude with the sun behind them, positioned perfectly to intercept. "It's uncanny," he reported to Göring on August 19th. "No matter where we attack, no matter what route we take, the British fighters are positioned exactly where they need to be. Either they have the most extraordinary luck in history, or they know we're coming." Göring dismissed the concerns. "The British are desperate men fighting over their own land. Of course they fight hard, increase the pressure, send more bombers, overwhelm them with numbers." The numbers were indeed overwhelming. On August 15th, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched nearly 2,000 sorties. This was Adlertag, Eagle Day, the day that was supposed to finish Fighter Command forever. German bombers hit airfields across southern England, Hawkinge, Lympne, Manston, Martlesham Heath. Facilities were damaged, hangars burned, aircraft were destroyed on the ground, but the British kept coming. Squadron leader Douglas Bader, leading 242 Squadron from Coltishall, shot down 2 Dorniers and a Messerschmitt that day. Bader had lost both legs in a flying accident before the war. He flew with artificial limbs and an aluminum walking stick stored in the cockpit. When German pilots later heard about him in prisoner of war camps, they refused to believe he existed. A legless pilot, scoffed Oberleutnant Julius Meimberg after his capture in 1941. This is British propaganda. No Air Force would allow such a thing. It's insulting to suggest we were shot down by a cripple. But Bader was real. So were the 17 German aircraft he would claim before being shot down himself in 1941. The Luftwaffe was discovering that everything they thought they knew about the British was wrong. The radar network that guided British fighters to their targets remained completely invisible to German intelligence throughout the battle. Reconnaissance photographs showed the tall towers, but analysts dismissed them as experimental. The concept of radio-based detection was known, but the Germans assumed the British system, if it existed at all, was primitive and unreliable. They were catastrophically mistaken. Flight Lieutenant Ronald Hamlin, a New Zealander flying with 74 Squadron, described the system's effectiveness in a letter home that made it past censors only because the recipient was a military officer. "Jerry still hasn't figured out how we're doing it," Hamlin wrote on August 24th. "They think we're psychic or impossibly lucky. The truth is simpler. We can see them coming from miles away. The girls in the filter room track them across the channel. The controllers vector us into position. By the time Jerry crosses the coast, we're already climbing to altitude with the sun behind us. They fly into death traps and don't understand why." The system wasn't perfect. Radar couldn't detect low-flying aircraft. The Observer Corps, 30,000 volunteers with binoculars and telephones, filled that gap. Information sometimes arrived late. Squadrons sometimes missed intercepts. But the system worked far better than anything the Germans possessed. By late August, Göring was forced to confront reality. Fighter command wasn't collapsing. If anything, the British were getting more aggressive. His 3-day promise had become a sick joke. After 2 weeks of sustained assault, the Luftwaffe had lost 275 aircraft. Fighter command had lost 148. The mathematics were moving in the wrong direction. August 24th, 1940. RAF Manston on the Kent coast. Flight Lieutenant Basil Wall stood beside his Hurricane, watching ground crew patch bullet holes. This was his 3rd aircraft in 2 weeks. The first had been shot up over Dover and crashed on landing. The second had taken cannon fire over Maidstone and burst into flames. He'd bailed out with minor burns. Now he was climbing into a 3rd Hurricane, knowing with absolute certainty that the odds were catching up with him. The exhaustion was worse than the fear. Wall recalled in a 1985 interview, "We'd fly 4, 5, sometimes 6 sorties a day, land, refuel, rearm, and go straight back up. We lived in our flight suits, slept in dispersal huts. I went 3 days once without seeing my bed. You'd land after a combat, hands shaking so badly you couldn't light a cigarette, and they'd tell you Jerry's forming up for another raid. 10 minutes to rest, then back in the cockpit." This was the period when fighter command came closest to breaking, not from lack of courage, but from simple mathematics. Doubting was losing pilots faster than training schools could replace them. Experienced flight leaders were dying. The replacement pilots arriving at squadrons had 20 hours in hurricanes and no combat experience. They died in their first week. Squadron leader Peter Townsend, commanding 85 Squadron at Croydon, lost 5 pilots in 3 days during late August. 2 were shot down on their first mission. One was a boy named Ronald, who'd arrived at the squadron on Monday morning and died on Tuesday afternoon. He'd flown exactly 2 combat sorties. "I knew his name for 24 hours, Townsend said in his post-war memoir. "I never really knew his face. The new boys would arrive, we'd send them up, and they wouldn't come back. There wasn't time to train them properly. There wasn't time for anything except survival." The Luftwaffe sensed weakness. Göring, frustrated by fighter command's refusal to die, ordered his forces to focus exclusively on airfields and aircraft factories. Forget London, forget the ports, destroy the fighters on the ground, obliterate their bases, make it impossible for them to operate. Between August 24th and September 6th, the Luftwaffe launched the most concentrated assault yet. They hit every major airfield in southeast England. Biggin Hill was bombed 6 times, Debden 4 times, Hornchurch 5 times. Manston was bombed so heavily it was temporarily abandoned. Buildings were destroyed. Runways were cratered. Telephone lines were cut. The system that had worked so effectively was starting to fracture under the weight of continuous assault. On September 1, 1940, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commanding 11 Group which defended southeast England, filed a confidential report to Dowding. The situation was critical. Pilot losses were unsustainable. Aircraft production couldn't keep pace with combat attrition. The sector stations controlling the squadrons were being systematically destroyed. "We are at the limit," Park wrote. "We cannot sustain this intensity for more than another fortnight without considering withdrawal to bases north of London." Withdrawal meant abandoning southern England. It meant ceding air superiority over the invasion beaches. It meant effectively losing the battle. Dowding read the report in his office at Bentley Priory. The austere commander, nicknamed Stuffy by his pilots for his formal manner, allowed himself a rare moment of despair. Fighter Command had fought magnificently. His pilots had exceeded anything that could be reasonably asked of them. But there were limits to what courage could achieve against overwhelming numbers. Then, on the evening of September 7, 1940, everything changed. The change began with a navigational error. On the night of August 24th, German bombers targeting oil facilities at Thames Haven accidentally dropped their bombs on central London. It was a mistake, pure and simple. The crews thought they were hitting legitimate targets. Winston Churchill, furious, ordered immediate retaliation. On August 25th, British bombers hit Berlin. The damage was minimal. A few houses destroyed, no significant industrial harm, but the psychological impact was enormous. Berlin, the capital of the Reich, had been violated. Hermann Göring had personally promised Hitler that no enemy aircraft would ever bomb Berlin. "If any enemy bomber reaches the Ruhr," Göring had boasted in 1939, "my name is not Hermann Göring. You can call me Meyer." Now Berlin had been bombed. Hitler was apoplectic. The Führer ranted about revenge, about teaching the British terror, about burning their cities to the ground. Göring, desperate to restore his credibility, promised immediate and overwhelming retaliation. On September 7th, at 4:30 in the afternoon, the radar stations along the Kent coast detected the largest raid yet. The operators counted formations extending from Dover to the Thames estuary. Over 300 bombers, more than 600 fighters. The entire available strength of Luftwaffe 2 and 3 was crossing the channel in a single devastating blow. But they weren't heading for the airfields. They were heading for London. Squadron leader Sandy Johnstone, leading 602 Squadron from West Hampnet, was one of the first to intercept. His Spitfires climbed toward the raid over Surrey, expecting the Germans to turn toward Biggin Hill or Kenley. Instead, the bombers kept flying north. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," Johnston recalled in 1958. "The whole sky was full of German aircraft, and they were all heading directly toward London. For a moment, I thought it was a feint. Then I realized they were actually going to bomb the city. It was militarily insane, but they were doing it anyway." The London docks erupted in flames. The East End burned. 448 civilians died that day. Over 1,000 were seriously injured. The attacks would continue for 57 consecutive nights, the beginning of the Blitz that would kill 40,000 Londoners before it ended. But Hitler's demand for revenge and Göring's desperate attempt to restore his reputation had just saved Fighter Command. The shift from airfields to London gave Dowding exactly what he needed: time. Fighter Command's battered sector stations could be repaired, cratered runways could be filled, communications networks could be restored, and most critically, the relentless pressure on his pilots eased just enough for them to catch their breath. Squadron leader Tom Gleave, recovering from severe burns after being shot down on August 31st, heard about the shift in German tactics from his hospital bed at East Grinstead. He immediately understood the implications. "They'd nearly broken us," Gleave said in a 1972 interview. "Another week of hitting the airfields, and we'd have been finished. Not beaten in the air, but unable to operate effectively. Then Hitler got angry and they switched to London. It was the mistake that saved us." The numbers tell the story. Between August 24th and September 6th, Fighter Command lost 295 aircraft. Between September 7th and September 30th, they lost 242 aircraft despite facing even more intense combat. The difference was that ground facilities were no longer being systematically destroyed. Damaged aircraft could be repaired, wounded pilots could recover, new squadrons could form without their airfields being bombed flat. But the battle was far from over. The Luftwaffe, having committed to the London strategy, poured everything into it. The daylight raids of September 8th, 9th, and 10th involved hundreds of aircraft. The night bombing was continuous. Göring believed, had convinced himself against all evidence, that fighter command was on the verge of collapse. German intelligence reports continued to paint an optimistic picture. Major Schmid's assessments claimed the British had fewer than 200 serviceable fighters remaining. The RAF was finished, just needed one more push. Victory was days away. Every assessment was fantasy, believed because Göring wanted to believe it. The climax came on September 15th, 1940, a bright Sunday morning with clear skies, perfect flying weather. The Luftwaffe assembled its forces for what Göring promised would be the knockout blow. 200 bombers with 600 fighters would hit London in two massive waves. Fighter command would either scramble everything they had and be destroyed, or stay on the ground and watch London burn. At Bentley Priory, Air Chief Marshal Dowding watched the plots develop on the operations board. The first wave was forming over France. 200-plus aircraft heading toward London. He had every squadron in 11 Group ready to scramble. More squadrons from 12 Group were already climbing to altitude. Even Duxford Wing, the controversial 5-squadron formation led by Douglas Bader, was airborne. Park, commanding 11 Group from Uxbridge, stood in his underground operations room watching the colored counters march across the map table. Each counter represented a squadron. He was committed. Everything he had was going up. Churchill was visiting Uxbridge that morning. The Prime Minister stood beside Park, watching silently as squadron after squadron was scrambled. Finally, Churchill turned to the Air Vice Marshal. "What reserves do we have?" Park looked at the board. Every squadron in the southeast was engaged or scrambling. There were no reserves. "There are none," Park replied quietly. Churchill said nothing, but witnesses reported he went pale. Over London, the battle reached an intensity not seen before or since in British skies. 300 British fighters clawed for altitude, racing to intercept before the bombers reached the city. German fighter pilots, confident this was the final push, dove eagerly into combat. Pilot Officer Robert Doe of 238 Squadron, already an ace with 11 kills, led his section into a formation of Dornier 17s over Maidstone. His combat report captured the chaos. "We went through them in line astern. I fired at one Dornier and saw strikes all along the fuselage. He fell away streaming smoke, pulled up, and immediately had to brake left to avoid a 109. My number 2 got him, reversed, and came back down on another Dornier. This one was already damaged, probably from someone else's attack. I gave him a 2-second burst and his starboard engine exploded. The whole wing folded up and he went down spinning." All across the sky, similar scenes played out. Spitfires and Hurricanes tore through bomber formations. Messerschmitts dove to protect the bombers. British fighters and German fighters spiraled around each other in individual combat. The sky over London filled with smoke trails, burning aircraft, parachutes, and the British kept coming. Every time German crews thought they'd broken through, more fighters appeared. Squadrons they'd been told no longer existed dove from the sun. The defensive fire from British fighters, 8 machine guns per aircraft firing in coordinated bursts, was devastating. Bombers that made it through the fighter screen found anti-aircraft fire waiting over London. The second wave, launched at 2 in the afternoon, faced the same reception. Park had pulled his squadrons back, rearmed and refueled them, and sent them up again. The Duxford Wing, arriving late but in overwhelming force, caught a formation of Dornier over the Thames without fighter escort. Bader's 5 squadrons destroyed 11 bombers in one pass. By evening, when the last German aircraft limped back across the channel, the Luftwaffe had lost 61 aircraft. Fighter command had lost 31. But more importantly, the Germans had failed to destroy fighter command. They hadn't even come close. That night, in the underground cabinet war rooms, Churchill composed his speech for Parliament. The words would become immortal. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. But the battle was already won, not because the British had destroyed the Luftwaffe, though they'd badly hurt it. The battle was won because Hitler, watching the casualty reports from September 15th, made a decision. On September 17, 1940, he postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The invasion of Britain was off. Without air superiority, the Wehrmacht couldn't cross the Channel, and the Luftwaffe, despite everything Göring had promised, couldn't deliver air superiority. The official end of the Battle of Britain is marked as October 31st, 1940. But the outcome was decided weeks earlier. After September 15th, the Luftwaffe shifted increasingly to night bombing. The great daylight raids stopped. The bomber formations that had darkened the sky over southern England disappeared. They disappeared because they'd been broken. Between July 10th and October 31st, the Luftwaffe lost 1,777 aircraft, more than half their bomber force, nearly a third of their fighters. But more devastating than the machines were the men. Experienced pilots were dead or captured. Bomber crews that had terrorized Poland and France were gone. The aura of invincibility was shattered. Fighter Command lost 915 aircraft. The difference seems small, just 862 aircraft. But those 862 aircraft represented the margin between victory and defeat, between survival and extinction. The human cost on both sides was staggering. 544 Fighter Command pilots died. 795 German airmen were killed. Thousands more were wounded or captured. But Britain was still flying, still fighting, still there. In November 1940, Hermann Göring was summoned to meet Hitler at the Berghof. The meeting, witnessed by several staff officers, was brutal. Hitler raged at his Luftwaffe commander for 3 hours. The failure to destroy the RAF, the loss of so many aircraft, the cancellation of Sea Lion, the humiliation of Berlin being bombed. "You promised me 3 days," Hitler screamed, according to notes taken by Nicholas von Below, Hitler's Luftwaffe adjutant. 3 days to destroy the British fighters. It's been 4 months. They're stronger now than when you started. Göring, for once in his life, had no boasts, no excuses, no elaborate explanations. The man who had stood before his commanders in August promising easy victory sat silent while Hitler's rage washed over him. "You told me the RAF was finished," Hitler continued. "You told me they had no reserves. You told me one more push would break them. Every word was a lie, and now we cannot invade. The British will remain a thorn in our side. Everything that goes wrong from now on, every delay in defeating Britain, is your failure." After the meeting, Göring returned to Carenhall a diminished figure. The jovial confidence was gone. The boasts stopped. He had promised to deliver Britain in 3 days and failed to deliver it in 3 months. In the Nazi hierarchy, where success was worshipped and failure was fatal, Göring's star began its long decline. Meanwhile, in Britain, the pilots of Fighter Command were receiving their recognition. On November 30th, 1940, a ceremony at Buckingham Palace saw dozens of pilots decorated for valor. Distinguished Flying Crosses, Distinguished Flying Medals, a few Distinguished Service Orders for the squadron commanders. Squadron leader Erich Locke, who'd claimed 26 German aircraft in 3 months of combat, stood in the receiving line wearing a uniform hastily pressed that morning. He was 20 years old. He'd joined the RAF straight from school. He would die 8 months later over France. But on that November day, he represented something that had proved stronger than German bombs or Göring's boasts. "We never thought we'd lose," Locke said in a brief interview after the ceremony. "Oh, we knew the odds were terrible. We knew most of us probably wouldn't survive. But losing, Britain surrendering, never crossed our minds. We'd fly until we were dead, and new boys would take our places and keep flying. Jerry could kill us individually, but he couldn't make us quit." That's what Göring didn't understand. The post-war analysis of the Battle of Britain fills volumes. Historians have examined every aspect: the radar system, the tactical decisions, the intelligence failures, the industrial production. All of it matters. All of it contributed. But Flight Lieutenant Geoffrey Wellham, who flew Spitfires with 92 Squadron through the entire battle, perhaps put it most simply in his memoir published decades later. "They thought we'd break because the mathematics said we should break. They had more aircraft, more pilots, more of everything. On paper, we didn't have a chance. What they couldn't measure, couldn't quantify with their intelligence reports and operational assessments was that we were fighting for our homes, our families, our country. You don't quit when the alternative is slavery. You fight. And you keep fighting until you win or you die. We were quite prepared to die. Fortunately for us, the Germans weren't. The long-term consequences of Göring's failed promise extended far beyond the immediate battle. The Luftwaffe never recovered its strength. The pilots lost over Britain couldn't be replaced. The confidence that had carried German forces across Europe was gone. When Hitler turned east in June 1941 to invade the Soviet Union, the Luftwaffe was still trying to rebuild from losses sustained over Britain. The Eastern Front would consume what remained, grinding down the German Air Force in a war of attrition even more brutal than the Battle of Britain. By 1943, when Allied bombers began the systematic destruction of German cities, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of what it had been. The same force that Göring had promised would crush the RAF in 3 days couldn't defend German skies against the combined might of RAF Bomber Command and the American 8th Air Force. There's a certain poetic justice in what followed. German civilians experienced what Londoners had endured: the fire, the destruction, the terror of bombs falling from above. But the scale was incomparably greater. Hamburg burned in 1943 with firestorms that killed 42,000 people. Dresden burned in 1945, killing at least 25,000. Berlin was bombed repeatedly, systematically reduced to rubble. Göring, watching his nation destroyed from the air, had nothing to offer but increasingly hollow promises. The jet fighters that would sweep Allied bombers from the sky. The secret weapons that would turn the tide. The final victory that was always just weeks away. None of it materialized. At the Nuremberg trials in 1946, Göring sat in the dock as prosecutors detailed his crimes, but even before they discussed the concentration camps, the slave labor, the looted art, they talked about his military failures. The Battle of Britain featured prominently. In his cell before sentencing, Göring was visited by Dr. Douglas Kelly, an American psychiatrist studying the Nazi leadership. Kelly asked about the Battle of Britain, about the promise to destroy the RAF in 3 days. According to Kelly's notes, Göring was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. "I believed my own propaganda. We all did. We'd won everything so easily. Poland in weeks, France in days. It seemed impossible that this little island could stand against us. I thought British morale would shatter. I thought Churchill would fall and moderates would negotiate peace. I thought our technological superiority was overwhelming." He paused, then continued. "We never understood that the British weren't fighting a normal war. They were fighting for survival. There's a difference. When you're fighting for territory or glory or empire, you can calculate odds and make rational decisions about when to quit. When you're fighting for existence, there is no quitting. We could kill their pilots and they'd find more. We could bomb their airfields and they'd repair them. We could destroy their aircraft and their factories would build more. We couldn't kill all of them. We couldn't bomb all of Britain flat. And as long as one British fighter remained in the sky, we hadn't won." Göring committed suicide before he could be executed, swallowing a cyanide capsule smuggled into his cell. His final message mentioned nothing about the Battle of Britain, but those who studied his decline pointed to that summer of 1940 as the beginning of his end. The man who had built the Luftwaffe, who had made it the most feared air force in the world, had watched it broken over Britain because he'd promised more than physics, mathematics, or human endurance could deliver. 15 years after the battle, in 1955, the surviving pilots of Fighter Command held a reunion at Biggin Hill. 200 men gathered, some walking with canes, some scarred from burns, all carrying memories of those desperate summer months. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, retired now and elevated to the peerage as Lord Dowding, addressed the gathering. The man who had been called Stuffy spoke with unusual emotion. "I was asked to do the impossible," he said, "to defend Britain with inadequate forces against overwhelming odds. I could not have done it without you. No commander in history has been served by braver men. You flew when you were exhausted. You fought when you were wounded. You returned to combat knowing the odds were against you, and you won." The surviving German pilots scattered across post-war Germany held their own reunions, but the tone was different. There was pride in how they'd fought, in their individual courage and skill. But there was no pride in the outcome. The Battle of Britain remained a wound in the Luftwaffe's collective memory. Adolf Galland, who'd commanded fighters during the battle and later became commander of Luftwaffe fighter forces, was remarkably candid in his post-war writings. "We were the best fighter pilots in the world in 1940, Galland wrote in his memoir. "We had the best training, the most combat experience, excellent aircraft. We should have won. The mathematics said we should have won. But we underestimated British determination and overestimated our own capabilities." Göring's promises weren't just wrong, they were dangerous because they made us complacent. We thought we just had to show up and the British would fold. Instead, they fought like demons. Every combat was desperate. Every pilot we faced was determined to take us down with him if necessary. The statistics from the battle have been analyzed endlessly. How many aircraft were actually destroyed? How many pilots killed? Whether the radar system was decisive or peripheral? Whether the Luftwaffe should have continued attacking airfields instead of switching to London. All of these questions matter to historians. But for the men who fought, the answer was simpler. Flight Lieutenant Tony Bartley, who flew Spitfires, throughout the battle, put it bluntly in a 1978 interview. "Did we think we'd win? Honestly, no. The Germans had us outnumbered 3-1 or more. Our aircraft were being shot up as fast as factories could build them. We were losing pilots we couldn't replace. By every rational measure, we should have lost. But there's this thing that happens when you're fighting for your home. You don't quit. You can't quit. Losing means your country enslaved, your family murdered, everything you know destroyed. So you keep fighting. One more sortie, one more combat, one more day. And somehow, day after day, we survived. And then we realized we weren't just surviving. We were winning. Not because we were better than the Germans, but because we refused to lose. The cost of that refusal was measured in lost youth. Of the 2,937 pilots who flew with Fighter Command during the battle, 544 died. Many more were wounded. Some were burned so badly they spent years in hospital, enduring dozens of surgeries. The Mackindale ward at East Grinstead Hospital became famous for treating burned airmen. Archie Mackindale, a pioneering plastic surgeon, developed new techniques for treating severe burns. His patients called themselves the Guinea Pig Club. They had lost their faces and were having them rebuilt piece by piece. Yet even these men, scarred almost beyond recognition, never expressed regret. They'd fought, they'd survived, and Britain remained free. In 1990, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, Queen Elizabeth unveiled a permanent memorial on the Thames Embankment in London. It lists the names of every pilot who flew during the Battle of Britain. 544 names are marked with a cross, denoting those who died. The ceremony included flyovers by a single Hurricane and Spitfire, the last airworthy examples from the battle itself. As the elderly veterans watched these ancient machines circle over London, the sky they'd defended so desperately 5 decades before, more than one was seen crying. Squadron leader Geoffrey Wellham, by then 70 years old, spoke to reporters after the ceremony. Göring promised Hitler 3 days. He was wrong about everything. The British willed to fight. The effectiveness of our defenses, the quality of our aircraft, the determination of our pilots. Everything he thought he knew was fantasy. But the biggest mistake was thinking courage could be measured in aircraft production statistics. You can't quantify what men will do when their backs are against the wall. You can't calculate the resolve of a nation fighting for survival. Göring made promises based on numbers. We answered with something that can't be counted. We won because we had to, because there was no alternative, because surrender was unthinkable. He paused, looking up at the memorial with its long list of names. Göring lived another 6 years after the battle. Every day of those 6 years, he had to carry the weight of his broken promise. Every defeat that followed, every German city burned, every Allied bomber over Germany, all of it traced back to his failure over Britain. We made him regret every word of that boast. Not just him. Every German pilot who thought they'd walk through us. Every bomber crew that expected easy pickings. We showed them what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness, restraint for cowardice. Britain was polite until we absolutely had to fight. Then we were the most dangerous enemy Germany ever faced. The truth is that the Battle of Britain was won in the unglamorous details that don't make for dramatic paintings. It was won by ground crews working through the night to repair damaged aircraft, by WAF plotters moving markers across map tables in underground operations rooms, by civilians digging through rubble to maintain communications lines, by factory workers building aircraft faster than the Germans could destroy them, by pilots flying when they were so exhausted they fell asleep during formation flights. It was won by a system that worked despite being stretched at breaking point, by leadership that made the right decisions more often than the wrong ones, by ordinary people doing extraordinary things because the alternative was unthinkable. Hermann Göring promised Hitler 3 days. Britain gave him 3 months of hell instead. And when it was over, when the last raid had been fought and the final tallies counted, the mathematics of victory were clear. The Luftwaffe had lost 1,777 aircraft trying to deliver on a promise that should never have been made. Fighter Command had lost 915 aircraft defending a nation that refused to die. Those 862 aircraft represented more than metal and engines. They represented the margin between civilization and barbarism, between freedom and slavery, between a Britain that bent but never broke and a Britain that might have ceased to exist. Göring's promise lasted exactly as long as it took for the first British fighters to climb into the summer sky over Kent. Then reality began dismantling the fantasy, one combat at a time, one determined pilot at a time, one impossible victory at a time. By September 15, 1940, the promise was broken beyond repair. By October 31st, it was buried beneath the wreckage of the once invincible Luftwaffe. Britain made Hermann Göring regret every word, and in doing so, proved that some things matter more than mathematics, that courage can trump overwhelming odds, and that free people defending their homes are the most dangerous force in the world. The pilots of Fighter Command flew and fought and died to deliver that lesson. It's a lesson that echoes still in the names carved on the memorial by the Thames, in the empty spaces at the reunions of survivors, in the 3 words that Churchill spoke and history remembers: the few. Never have those words carried more weight. Never have so many owed so much to so few who gave everything when their nation needed it most. And never has a boastful promise been so thoroughly, completely, and justly destroyed.